More than 1,000 years ago, a man would place his hand on a freshly cut oak plank, feel the texture of the wood, close his eyes for a moment, and know, just by touch, whether that piece would be able to face the North Sea. No paper, no technical drawing, no ruler, just knowledge passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, over generations. And the most impressive part is that this same craft, with the same techniques, the same movements, and almost the same tools, still exists today. In small workshops hidden in the fjords of Norway, men continue to build boats exactly the way the Vikings did. It's not a reconstruction. It's not a staged living museum for tourists. It's a craft that never stopped. One that survived empires, wars, industrial revolutions, 2 world wars, and the digital age, and remains alive, beating, working, being taught to new hands. Today I'm going to tell you the story of this craft. How it was born, how it allowed the Vikings to dominate the seas, why it nearly disappeared, and how, against all odds, it survived to this day. Stick around until the end, because this is one of the most fascinating stories about engineering, tradition, and human stubbornness you'll ever hear. To understand this craft, you first need to understand one thing. The Vikings didn't invent boat building. They perfected something that had already existed for centuries. Archaeologists found in southern Denmark a boat known as the Nidem boat, built around the year 320 AD, nearly 500 years before the so-called Viking Age officially began. That boat already used a very specific construction technique, technically called overlapping construction, or clinker, as it's known in English. In Scandinavia, this technique is called klinkbygging, and the principle is simple to understand, but incredibly difficult to execute well. Imagine building a boat's hull not with a single curved sheet, like modern fiberglass or steel boats, but with several wooden planks, each one slightly overlapping the one below, like roof tiles, only vertically, forming the sides of the hull. Each plank fits over the one beneath it, held by iron rivets or wooden pegs, and the gap between them is caulked, meaning sealed, usually with sheep's wool soaked in tar or pine resin to keep water out. The result is a hull that is light, flexible, and extremely strong. And here's the secret that made this technique so special. Unlike a rigid boat, a clinker hull can flex slightly with the motion of the waves. It absorbs the impact of the sea instead of resisting it with brute force. It's like the difference between a rigid building and one built to sway slightly during an earthquake. In this case, flexibility is strength. The Vikings took this knowledge, already refined for centuries by Germanic and Scandinavian peoples, and pushed it to a level of engineering that seems almost impossible for the time. You've probably heard of the famous drakers, the long Viking ships, with the prow carved into the shape of a dragon's head. 2 examples that survive today, found buried as ceremonial tombs in Norway, are the Oseberg ship, from around the year 820, and the Gokstad ship, from around 890. These boats, now on display in a museum in Oslo, are true masterpieces of engineering. The hull of the Gokstad ship, for example, has main planks only about 2 centimeters thick, yet it was capable of crossing the North Atlantic, weathering violent storms, and still sailing in shallow rivers, because its draft, how deep it sits in the water, was minimal. That means the same boat that crossed the open ocean could also travel up narrow, shallow rivers to carry out surprise raids on inland villages. No other civilization of the time had that combination of ocean speed and river mobility. And that is exactly why the Vikings managed something that seemed impossible, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and around the year 1000, reaching North America, 500 years before Columbus, relying basically on wind power, oars, and the genius of this construction technique. It's worth pausing here to grasp what that really means. We're talking about open vessels, with no cabin, no shelter from the weather, crossing one of the most violent oceans on the planet, guided only by the position of the sun, the stars, the behavior of birds, and a deep knowledge of ocean currents. There was no reliable compass at the time. There was no precise map. There was accumulated experience, passed down orally, and a boat so well built that trusting it was literally a matter of life and death. Every plank overlap, every rivet, every layer of tar represented the difference between reaching the other side of the ocean or vanishing into the icy waters of the North Atlantic. But building one of these boats wasn't simple. It was a process that could take months, depending on the size of the vessel, and required deep, almost intuitive knowledge of wood. Viking builders didn't use saws to cut the planks into the shapes they needed. They used axes. And not just any axe, but tools specifically meant to split wood along its natural grain, rather than cutting across it. This distinction is crucial. When you split wood along its natural grain, it keeps its structural strength. When you saw across the grain, you cut through the wood's internal fibers, and it becomes weaker, more prone to cracking under pressure. This knowledge, splitting oak logs radially like slices of a pizza cut from the center, allowed each plank to have maximum strength with minimum weight. It's a level of materials engineering optimization that was only rediscovered and formally studied by materials science centuries later. Choosing the right tree was, in itself, an art. Builders would walk through the forest observing the natural shape of each oak, looking for trunks that already had a slight natural curve suited to specific parts of the boat, such as the keel, the ship's backbone, or the ribs, the internal frames that give the hull its structure. Using a natural curve in the wood, instead of forcing a straight piece to bend artificially, made the piece infinitely stronger, because the wood's internal fibers already followed that curve without being cut or broken in the process. This means that even before picking up an axe, a Viking builder essentially had to be a deep, practical expert in botany and the structural behavior of wood. Once split, the planks were shaped with specific hand axes and, when needed, steam bent. Builders heated the wood, usually over fire or boiling water vapor, until the fibers became pliable enough to bend into the exact curve of the hull without breaking. This is still called steam bending today, and it's a technique still used in fine modern woodworking. Once shaped, the planks were overlapped and fastened with hand-forged iron rivets, hammered in one by one, each aligned by hand, with no industrial standardization of any kind. Every boat was literally a unique piece, shaped to the conditions of that specific wood, that specific trunk, by the hands of that specific builder. And here's something I find fascinating. There were no blueprints, technical drawings, or written manuals. The knowledge of how to build these boats lived entirely in the memory and practical experience of the master builders. It was knowledge passed down orally and by demonstration, from master to apprentice, over years of working side by side. An apprentice might spend his entire childhood alongside his father or a master builder, learning to recognize, just by the sound the wood made when struck, whether it had some internal defect invisible to the naked eye. Learning to calculate, just by observing the natural curve of a trunk, how that wood should be cut to become the perfect piece for a specific part of the hull. This isn't a skill you learn in a 6-month course. It's a skill absorbed over an entire lifetime of practice. There was also an almost spiritual dimension to this process. For the Vikings, the boat wasn't just a means of transportation. It was a symbol of status, of power, and often of family identity. Important chieftains were buried inside their own ships, as happened with the Oseberg and Gokstad ships, which were found precisely because they served as ceremonial tombs, filled with personal belongings, tools, and in some cases, even sacrificed animals as part of funeral rituals. Building a boat, therefore, wasn't just technical work. In a way, it was an almost sacred act, requiring respect, patience, and deep knowledge passed down from generation to generation. Now you must be wondering, how did such a specific craft, so tied to a warrior culture that dominated Northern Europe over 1,000 years ago, still exist today? The answer lies in one simple but powerful detail. The Vikings, as a warrior and political culture, disappeared around the 11th century, with the Christianization of Scandinavia and the integration of these societies into medieval European kingdoms. But the people who lived there, the fishermen, the farmers, the residents of coastal villages, kept on existing, and they kept needing boats, no longer for war and plunder, but to fish, to transport goods, to move between the islands and fjords of the Norwegian coast, which remains, to this day, one of the most jagged, island-filled regions on the planet. So what happened was that the clinker construction technique simply changed purpose, but never changed method. The same families of builders, generation after generation, kept adapting the size and shape of the boats to new needs. Smaller vessels emerged, like the Feiring, a small forward rowboat used by fishermen, and later the famous Oselver, a traditional boat type from the Os region near Bergen, Norway, which is still built today using the exact same clinker technique, with overlapping, hand-riveted planks. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the age of great naval exploration, and even the Industrial Revolution, while the rest of Europe migrated to large-scale shipbuilding methods, using steel plates and later fiberglass, these isolated coastal communities in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark kept building their boats exactly as their Viking ancestors had. Not out of nostalgic attachment to the past, but because for those specific waters, for those narrow and unpredictable fjords, that technique simply remained the best possible solution. This is something important to understand about traditional crafts that survive over time. They don't survive out of sentimentality. They survive because they continue to be, in practice, the best tool for a real problem. A clinker boat is light enough to be pulled up onto the beach by 2 or 3 people. It's flexible enough to withstand wave impact in rough seas without breaking. It's reparable with simple tools, without depending on factories or industrial parts. For a fisherman on a small Norwegian island, that's not tradition. That's pure practicality. Think about how many technologies throughout history were abandoned as soon as something faster or cheaper came along. Clinker construction should have been one of them. And for a long time, it seemed that would be exactly this craft's fate. In the 20th century, with the industrialization of fishing and shipbuilding, diesel engines, and mass-produced fiberglass hulls at much lower cost, the number of clinker boat builders plummeted dramatically. Factories could produce dozens of standardized fiberglass boats in the time it took a master craftsman to build a single wooden boat. Prices were lower, maintenance was simpler, and a new generation of young Norwegians saw in the big cities, in the North Sea oil industry, and in urban jobs, a much more appealing life than spending years learning to split oak wood with an axe. Many master builders couldn't find apprentices willing to dedicate so much time to such labor-intensive work when faster, more lucrative jobs existed elsewhere. For decades, this knowledge was on the verge of disappearing entirely, kept alive by a handful of stubborn families in remote villages who refused to let that knowledge die with them. There was a moment, between the 1960s and 1980s, when Norwegian researchers and maritime historians began to seriously worry about the definitive disappearance of this tradition. Some of the last great master builders of the clinker technique were already elderly men, with no interested successors, and the fear was real. When these people died, over 1,000 years of knowledge could simply vanish with them, with no systematic record that would allow it to be recovered later. And it was exactly this threat of extinction that sparked a preservation movement. Over the last 30 or 40 years, there has been a growing effort in Norway and other Nordic countries to document, film, photograph, and above all, formally teach these techniques before the last master builders disappeared. Schools for traditional crafts were created specifically for this purpose. Workshops like the famous Oselvarverkstaden in the OS region of Norway began operating as structured teaching centers, where master builders formally trained new apprentices, often young people who deliberately chose to leave behind urban, academic, or corporate careers to learn a manual craft, exactly as an apprentice would have done 1,000 years ago, only now with a formal certificate at the end of the process. And in 2021, something extraordinary happened. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, officially recognized the Nordic clinker boat building traditions through a joint application submitted by Norway and other Nordic countries as intangible cultural heritage of humanity. This means that this technique, born even before the Viking Age, perfected by the Vikings, and kept alive by fishing communities for over 1,000 years, was formally recognized by the entire world as a cultural treasure that must be protected and passed on to future generations. This recognition wasn't merely symbolic. It brought funding, international attention, and new momentum to schools and workshops that, until shortly before, had been struggling to survive. Think about what that means. We're talking about an unbroken line of practical knowledge spanning more than 1,500 years of human history. While empires rose and fell, while entire languages disappeared, while technologies were invented and abandoned, this specific craft continued to be practiced, hand to hand, axe to axe, rivet to rivet, never fully stopping. Today, if you visit certain coastal regions of Norway, you can still walk into a wooden workshop, smell the tar and the oak wood scorched by steam, hear the sound of a hammer driving iron rivets, and watch a man, with calloused hands and a focused gaze, shaping a plank in exactly the same way a Viking builder would have done more than 1,000 years ago, in the same kind of fjord, under the same kind of gray Nordic sky. And the most interesting part is that this craft didn't survive merely as an isolated historical curiosity. It shaped all of Western shipbuilding. When the Vikings spread across Europe, through invasions, trade, and colonization, they carried their shipbuilding techniques with them. England, for example, was deeply influenced by the Viking presence, especially in the region that became known as the Danelaw, in the east and north of the country. Naval historians point out that the British tradition of building rowboats and small fishing vessels, especially along England's east coast, carries a direct influence from the Scandinavian clinker technique, which continued to be used in lifeboats and British fishing vessels well into the 20th century. In other words, even in places where no one identifies as a direct Viking descendant anymore, the echo of this construction technique still lives on in the way certain traditional boats are made to this day. The very English word clinker, still used today in naval engineering worldwide to describe this type of overlapping construction, is a direct inheritance from Old Norse nautical vocabulary. There's a bigger lesson here, one that goes far beyond wooden boats. This craft survived for more than 1,000 years for a few very specific reasons, and those reasons say a lot about what makes knowledge endure through time. First, it solved a real problem and kept solving that problem even as the context changed, from war to fishing, from conquest to subsistence. A craft that serves only a single purpose tends to die along with that purpose. But a craft that adapts, that keeps delivering practical value even as the world around it changes completely, has a much better chance of surviving for centuries. Second, it was passed down directly, practically, person to person, which created an emotional and communal bond far stronger than any written manual could ever create. A book can be lost, burned, or forgotten on a shelf. But lived knowledge, felt in the hands, taught through repetition and shared time, tends to take root far more deeply in a community's identity. Third, and perhaps most important, it survived because even in the darkest periods, there was always at least one person willing to keep practicing, to keep teaching, even without knowing whether that knowledge would have a future. It was this quiet stubbornness, those families in isolated villages who refused to let the fire go out, that ensured that centuries later, this knowledge would still be there to be rediscovered, valued, and formally preserved by the entire world. There was no grand strategic plan for cultural preservation across those 1,000 years. Instead, there were thousands of small individual decisions. Parents who taught their children, masters who took on apprentices, communities that kept valuing this work even when it was no longer the fastest or cheapest option available. Today, young Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes are once again taking interest in this craft. Not out of survival necessity, like their fisherman ancestors, but out of a genuine desire to reconnect with authentic manual work in a world increasingly dominated by screens, algorithms, and mass production. There is something deeply human about taking a raw piece of wood and with your own hands, simple tools, and knowledge accumulated over generations, transforming it into something that will float, sail, face the sea, and perhaps, one day, be passed on for someone else to keep using. In an age when almost everything around us is disposable, mass-produced, and replaceable, there is something powerful about a craft that values exactly the opposite: patience, durability, uniqueness, and a direct connection between the maker and the thing made. Next time you hear the word Viking, your mind will probably go straight to images of warriors with axes, helmets, and bloody battles. But perhaps the most lasting and impressive legacy the Vikings left the world wasn't war, but this quiet, patient skill of turning wood into vessels capable of crossing the most hostile ocean on the planet. A craft that was born before the Vikings themselves, that they perfected to an almost scientific level of engineering, that survived the fall of their own culture, that made it through the Middle Ages, industrialization, and nearly went extinct in the 20th century, but that thanks to the stubbornness of a few families in remote Norwegian fjords, remains alive today, still being taught, practiced, and officially recognized as one of humanity's most important cultural treasures. 1,000 years of history, held in the hands of men who never let that fire go out. And that, to me, is far more impressive than any Viking War legend you've ever heard.